Hello, I'm Shannon Caine. Welcome to the Caine Interviews. On today's program, we'll be talking with Aubrey Shepherd. He's a journalist, environmental activist, and photographer. He's been quite active in Northwest Arkansas, speaking out on a wide variety of subjects. Today, we'll be discussing local environmental issues and much more. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks for letting me be here, Shannon.
All right. Let's start off with the World Peace Wetland Prairie. What is that?
Well, that's a very small 2.5 acre parcel of land that is in a part of the city which is basically prairie land. Mm-hmm. When you come off our hills here, our mountains, as we like to call them in Arkansas, you have a gentle slope for a ways, and then you have a basically level area, which in every case parallels a stream. All these streams that run off these hilltops. And in this case, World Peace Wetland Prairie is in the Town Branch watershed. It's the watershed that drains the University of Arkansas campus, the south side of the university campus. North side of the university campus, of course, goes to the Illinois River watershed. But anyway, the Town Branch is the waterway that drains into the West Fork of the White River. And the World Peace Wetland Prairie is an area that actually serves to protect and clean that stream just a little bit. It can't do it all because not all the water runs through there. But in an ideal world, we would protect a little wetland everywhere that we're developing something. This way the water pours into the natural soil where it's absorbed, and you have native plants that will utilize the nutrients in there. And then that sends clean water directly into the main body of water where we get our drinking water, Beaver Lake.
Okay, now you'd mentioned native plant species. I know you've photographed a number of these species. What is so special about these particular plants?
Well, so many of them that we emphasize saving and protecting, and that I like to photograph, and many other people do too, are plants that don't require a lot of care. You don't have to trim them quite as much. You don't have to fertilize them. If there's a drought, they survive the drought. If there's a really wet spell and they're in standing water, they're going to tolerate that, and that's because they've always been here. So many of the species on the prairie lands depend on a root system that's very old. And even poison ivy growing out in one of these natural areas, you'll find huge roots of poison ivy underground. You'll find many types of plants have root systems, and if it's mowed or there's a fire, then this plant will come back from that condition. If there's a drought, it'll look like it's all dead. So these are valuable plants. They're beautiful plants. And they're things that you can depend on for various kinds of food for wildlife and people who like herbal medicine. Mm-hmm. There are many of those wild things around here are good for those purposes as well as for food.
Okay, now for a non-native species, I know that some people are trying to eradicate certain species of honeysuckle that grow in this area. Why is that?
Well, that's the biggest problem we have at World Peace Wetland Prairie. Our biggest effort is trimming out honeysuckle. And if you just go in and massively cut everything, you'll lose a lot of the native species, and it'll take several years for certain things to grow back that you'd like to keep. So wherever we can, we try to actually trim the honeysuckle off the plants that are there. Then we can see them bloom and decide at some point if we want to keep those plants as native species. But if you're covered with honeysuckle, nobody can tell who you are. So
right.
That's the reason to do it. Honeysuckle
okay, so it's
is invasive.
It's an invasive plant. All right.
But let me add this one thing. That doesn't mean that the birds and wildlife aren't utilizing it. Mm-hmm. Deer love to eat honeysuckle green, but there are native species of honeysuckle, and there's one called a trumpet honeysuckle that has a red flower that's only slightly different from the Japanese honeysuckle, and we have some of that. Some of the difference is the Japanese honeysuckle will wrap tightly around your tree trunk, and actually kill the tree, or it'll kill a blade of grass or a flower plant. So the native honeysuckle tends to attach and climb, but it doesn't wrap, and so it doesn't kill the other plants, and it has a different kind of flowering setup and so forth. You can recognize it.
Okay. Now, can you tell us about silt that runs into the area streams and why it's a problem?
Well, I suppose most of us who, like me at least, grown up fishing, and what you find in northwest Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, Missouri, and all the way down to well past Hot Springs in Arkansas, you have smallmouth bass in clear water streams. And those streams are quite different from what I grew up with in Louisiana, where the water always seemed to be a little muddy unless it was full of vegetation. And so many of those fish could spawn in a muddy bottom. But smallmouth bass and rock bass and some other species that we love to go for in northwest Arkansas depend on a clean rock bottom, just as trout does. And if you allow silt, muddy runoff into the streams, then that water will not produce fish. The next thing, of course, is more practical to everybody. It's going to cost the city and the county and the Beaver Water District more money to clean up the water for you to drink. So that's another reason to keep the silt out.
Okay. In many locations, public lands are being sold off to private corporations. Has this been happening much in the Fayetteville area?
Well, there was a striking instance about 5 years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, that's called Wilson Spring. And that property was city-owned for some years. They had plans for an industrial park there. They discovered it was wetland. It wasn't suitable for heavy industry. And people like Joe Neal and Andrea Radwell went out there and worked very hard for months and months to show the value of that land as wetland, for its value in cleaning the Illinois River watershed, as we were talking about, and also for its value for habitat for birds, many species of birds that live in grassland, the tall grass that we have on our prairies. And so they worked very hard to demonstrate that, but turned out the city council finally agreed to sell the land for development, and we're getting a new Sam's store there and some other nice things, but there's no way to get back that kind of environmental situation. That was a magnificent area to demonstrate what our country used to be like.
Wow. Okay. What city regulations and policies would you most like to see changed in Fayetteville?
Well, I guess that carries over from my last sentence about the tall grass. I heard a story about someone recently who had a classic prairie tall grass inside their yard, and because they love it, and the person happens to be a scientist that's very knowledgeable about such things, and neighbor complained because that tall grass was sticking higher than the 6-foot privacy fence, and the city asked them to mow that down. And there's no reason to imagine that tall grass would be dangerous or detrimental if it were a decorative plant of the same size, but this was a native species. So I think our regulations in many areas, particularly those, could be more logical, simplified, so that, for instance, this time of year, in a year when gasoline's over $3 a gallon, requiring people to mow frequently is not a smart thing to do. I mean, we're trying to develop a sustainable city, and so some of the code regulations could be adjusted to fit that reality.
Now, moving on to birds, I know you have an interest in that. And is there a way, aside from just putting bird seed out in feeders, that people can attract birds to their yards locally?
Well, Shannon, one of the best things you can do really is to plant some of these native species. And if you were allowed to have some tall grass in your yard, but certainly plenty of native species of that produce seed and have flowers that will do triple duty. In many cases, the bud of the flower may be eaten by a bird, and the flower itself may attract the bees and the butterflies. But the birds, most of the birds that we're interested in seeing at feeders are going to have their nest not in that tall pine or that tall oak tree over there. They're going to nest at probably from 8 feet to 12 feet in the what we call understory vegetation, or on the lower limbs of some of the larger trees. So the same kinds of trees that the power company will allow you to put under the power lines, those are very important. So regardless of a mix of species of that sort in your yard and a mix of bushes that will give birds privacy for nesting, that'll keep the birds reproducing in your neighborhood and able to spend the night in your neighborhood and not just show up once a day or once a year to your feeder.
Okay. Now, speaking of birds, you've done some work documenting Canadian geese. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, the Canada geese were not coming south 30 years ago. They had started finding that there was grain all year in Iowa, in the Missouri River Valley, Nebraska, and Kansas. So the Canada geese did not get to Arkansas anymore. So somewhere in the 80s, as this trend had gotten extremely bad, I can't remember what year, in the 70s, I think, Tyson Food Company supplied the facilities down near Clarksville, I guess, off the interstate, and Game and Fish got eggs from Canada geese and brought them down, and they were hatched there. And they had a huge plot of land fenced in to keep the Canada geese there for a few years so they wouldn't wander off and get in the highway and get shot or get all the things that can happen. So they raised them till you could drive by and see many, many Canada geese. So then they started leaving there as the population got larger, and they went all over the state. In northwest Arkansas, you can find them on golf courses, you can find them on Beaver Lake, you can find them in people's yards, out by the jail, the new jail in South Fayetteville. There are some Canada geese walk around out there and feed on that nice grass. So they're just very interesting. And I grew up at a time when there were no Canada geese coming south. I lived in North Louisiana. Neither Louisiana nor Arkansas had a huntable supply of deer when I was a youngster, or wild turkey. So those species to me are more like a zoo species would be to somebody who grew up with those and thinks, well, they're just common, I can shoot all those, I don't care about them, what's the difference? But they're just amazing, beautiful species to study.
Okay. Could you explain for us the concept of a rain garden?
Well, that goes back to our first subject of the land off the side of the mountains in our area. A rain garden is a name for something we decide to create. It could be no larger than this stage, the circular stage we're sitting on. But the idea would be that it would have the capacity to catch the water off your roof. It would be near your home, downhill slightly, and it would have some of that soil we were talking about, some of that natural soil that is in these valleys and in these prairies. It's very rich soil, and it absorbs water. And so your rainwater comes off in there. You're not wasting it. It's not running down the street to the storm drain and taking the oil and so forth with it. It's going to soak in and feed those plants that you select. And again, the rain gardens that the Beaver Water District and the county extension people are working on, and Audubon and Sierra and just a whole array of environmental groups. These demonstration rain gardens are selecting or using primarily native species so that they'll do extremely well when they have all that rain running off the roof routed in there. But at the same time, if it's extremely dry, as it usually is here for 6 weeks of the summer or more, they won't all die. They will be ready to come back as soon as they have water in good conditions. They don't require fertilizer, and they don't require much care. So that's what a rain garden is, but basically old folks often had one and didn't call it that. They just had a part of the yard that was allowed to grow up in plants that they loved, and it absorbed the water.
Okay. In brief, what could be done to protect the Town Branch watershed?
Well, maybe if all of us just think a little bit about the amount of water we use and how we use it. Things like don't use soapy water to wash your car and let it go down the street or down into your neighbor's yard or whatever, into the storm drains, the worst place it can go, because what goes in the storm drains not treat. What goes in your sink or toilet or bathtub goes through a treatment process. But what you pour in the street goes into a storm drain and into the creek. There's not a storm drain direct to a treatment facility. That storm drain goes to the Town Branch of the West Fork of the White River, or it goes to Skull Creek or one of the others that runs to the Illinois River. So you're polluting with everything you drop in your yard. So that's a big part of it. But using less detergent, using no bug spray if you can avoid it, avoid all chemicals that you might pollute the water with. Doesn't mean you can't use some when you have to have it, but it means don't use an excess amount, and you can really help.
Okay. Now, if someone were getting interested in getting involved with environmental causes on the local level, what could he or she do?
Well, right now there's a wonderful coalition, and I think if you think about the Washington County Extension agent, think about the Beaver Water District, you think about the Arkansas, or Audubon, Arkansas has an office downtown Fayetteville. Sierra Club has a very active chapter here. The Nature Conservancy has a presence with many members here. The Ducks Unlimited has banquet in every significant sized town hereabouts. There are just all these people that you can connect with. The Omni Center for Peace, Justice, and Ecology has a very active contingent working on global warming and these things. Okay. So if you just want to call one person, maybe call the county extension office and ask about the environmental issues if you don't know about these. We could give you a long list, but that's a good place to start.
So there's a lot going on. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for telling us about it, and thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you for letting us be here.
All right. You've been watching the Caine Interviews on CAT TV, Channel 18 Fayetteville. Stay tuned for more interesting programming, and catch you next time.
Every time I tune into it, it's an important program. I like to see local people doing things.
So that's, since you asked me to do it, that's what I present the lease for you.
Now you're people, and we're people. We've got to be to convince people.
It's over there, they're green. Considered green shade.
Now there's several ways, and there's several days to convince people. And there's several ways.
When I was young, my mother told me not to question authority. Don't fight the system, she told me. They'll get you every time. My guidance counselor said gas and grapes don't mix. When it was my head I was trying to fix. Mother Nature, it ain't what you told me. It hurts me when you lie. I'm just leaving with what I came with. All the king's rules I'm rearranging. Suing Mother Nature, 'cause I'm jaded. The promise she gave me, I'm through taking. When I was young, I stood on a ledge and laughed. That God could take me if he asked. Now I deal with mortality, a bad case of reality. And then I thought you could master yourself, pass your problems to someone else. Mother Nature, it ain't what you told me. It hurts me when you lie. I'm just leaving with what I came with. All the king's rules I'm rearranging. Suing Mother Nature, 'cause I'm jaded. Thomas, she